All right. Howdy.
Howdy. Yeah, let me introduce you.
Oh, sure.
Very briefly. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our last Stack Cafe of the semester. Again, my name is Alexander Poulter. I'm the Stack Cafe organizer. So this is actually the last Stack Cafe that I'll be organizing. Very bittersweet. But our last speaker today is Dr. Alex Asher, who is a biostatistician and software developer at StataCorp. And he's actually an alum of the Texas A&M Statistics Department as of 8 years ago. Right?
Yes, sir.
Fabulous. So he has a PhD from here, and he currently focuses on developing methodology for cancer research. He's very good at inverting covariance matrices with his bare hands, which is a superpower, I think. And his interests include biostatistics, semi-parametrics, machine learning, stats education, and Bayesian statistics. So welcome, Dr. Evan.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I'll say it's a pleasure to be back here in Blocker. I spent a lot of time, mostly on the fourth floor, and not much has changed. New faces, though. So let me give you a little overview. We have a. Let's try this. There we go. So a little outline of what I'll be talking about today. So I was asked to give a sort of a stats talk, and I will, but I realized that when I was sort of at the other side of the seat, there were a lot of questions I had about life after grad school, about job searches, stuff like that. And I thought, you know what? Now that I'm on the side of the Zoom camera who is doing the interviews, I might as well share some of that information to y'all. So just so I can have a sense of the audience, is everyone here a PhD student?
No, there's a mix. Yeah.
Mixed masters and PhD students? Okay, awesome. And then of the folks who are PhD students, how far along are y'all? Do most folks have advisors, have research topics, past quals, that sort of stuff, or a lot of folks pretty early on, first year or so? Anyone first year, second year?
Fifth year myself.
Fifth year, all right. Second? Okay, awesome. So for right now, before you enter the job market, and this is true for whether you're master's, PhD, whatever level, regarding finding an advisor, it looks like most of y'all have figured that out. I got some really good advice before I started grad school, which was look around and see whose students graduate. Now, this is not, at least it wasn't a problem when I was here in this department. This department was really good at getting people out. Physical sciences are notorious, anything that involves a lab where things could go wrong and, your petri dish gets contaminated. They're notorious for having 8th, 9th year doctoral students. So look around and see who gets their students out when you're picking an advisor. Also, clearly, what research topic interests you. You're going to spend a lot of time doing it, so you might as well pick something that is interesting. Most folks in statistics have pretty wide interests, so you can use the tool set that you learn as a statistician on a wide range of problems, which for a lot of us, that's kind of what draws us to the field. It's really cool to have this toolkit that you can use on medical studies like I'm going to talk about today. You can use it on business analytics. You can use it on supply chain optimization. You can use it on, economics. So if you find something that you're willing to spend a lot of hours for a lot of days for a number of years on, then you'll be much happier. And then the other really good piece of advice I got early on in my PhD program was make your LinkedIn profile now. And that's true for all networking, but LinkedIn is kind of the de facto social network for getting a job. And you don't want the first time that you reach out and connect with someone to say, hey, I want a job, I want a favor, I want a recommendation, I want something. It's much more effective if you can make those connections early, have your profile set up, make your website, which used to be a lot more work. Now with GitHub Copilot or other AI tools, you can make a nice looking website in an afternoon. And as someone who reads a lot of resumes and interviews a lot of folks, if you have on the top of your resume your own website, that's great. That's a really good place for me to go. That way I know I'm not getting anything filtered through anything else. This is exactly what you want the world to see. I would say social media, when you start applying for jobs, I would highly recommend putting those to private. Generally, you don't want people. Now, if you have a professional Twitter account where you tweet about, stats or your research, then that's one thing. But generally, you don't want people seeing your, dog pics when you're applying for jobs. So set that stuff to private, lean in on the LinkedIn, and again, GitHub, your own website. Um, those are all really good tools. And sometimes it might feel a little awkward to just sort of reach out of the blue on LinkedIn. LinkedIn's really good at making that easy. But the other thing is, you might think, well, I don't have a large body of work to my name. What am I doing? Contacting this, I don't know, named chair, this distinguished professor, this, industry titan or whatnot. Folks really like it when people take an interest in their work. So if you're reaching out to somebody who is, well ahead of you in their career, and you say, "Hey, I love this paper that you wrote. It's really interesting. Can we connect on LinkedIn?" That's, I mean, it works 9 times out of 10. People are really flattered and willing to engage. And I mean, just like you guys will be several years from now, looking back, folks are really happy to give a hand up to the next generation coming through basically the same road that they did. Um, so, okay, under giving talks, so something like this, like the Stat Cafe, is it open for grad students as well?
Yeah, this is basically entirely for grad students, so master's, PhD,
I mean,
postdoc.
sorry, to give the talks.
Yeah, yeah,
Oh, perfect. Yeah. So something like this is a great forum. I don't think it was called Stat Cafe when I was a student here, but we had a similar thing where students could give talks to their peers. So I gave talks on, like code optimization and profiling and, I don't know, gradient descent, some other stuff. And it was a really good, it's a low stakes environment where you can hone some of your public speaking things that really shows when you're interviewing, or, I mean, depending on what job you're going to do, you might not be standing up in front of folks a lot, but for the interview process, you really will. So it's a very good experience. I would highly recommend, even if you don't feel like you're the ultimate authority in something, something low stakes like this, and then get some experience, do a poster presentation if you're not comfortable submitting something for giving a talk. But when you do give talks, most advisors are really good about helping their students out, about listening to their talks, proofreading their notes, letting them do a couple dry runs first, so that you've done this a few times before you're doing your big job market talk at the university that you really want to get hired at, or the company you want to get hired at. Um, Another thing is leadership roles. So, no, gosh, like 10 years ago, I was the SGSA president, and it was a great experience for me. And it also opened up a lot of doors. I was the one emailing Larry Wasserman to ask him to come over, and I was the one doing this and the other. And it does take effort, it does take time, but you really get the payoff professionally, and also an experience. So I would say that's definitely worth it. If you're a reviewer for journals, like that counts, that matters. If you're contributing to the American Statistical Association, stuff like that, those are all really good leadership experiences, and put that stuff in your resume. Um, Speaking, I think I talk about resumes in the next one, but if you are applying for both industry and academic jobs, make a resume and a CV. Do not send a 15-page CV to a tech startup, because you will not get a call back. And again, with AI tools these days, that's actually really easy. Back when I was a grad student, the domestic students were a relative minority, and I would proofread most of my international students' CVs and cover letters and stuff, because you wanted it to sound good. Nowadays, you don't really have to do that as much, but I will tell you, as someone who reads a lot of resumes, if I read something that is obviously handwritten, even if the grammar is not perfect, I know that person took a lot of time. They wrote that cover letter just for my company. They researched my company. They didn't just say, GPT, look up the top 20, job postings, research the companies, and write me cover letters for them. And they're all beautiful, flowery language that don't really say much. So I can't say that every other hiring manager will do this, but for me, if it is clear that you put your own effort into writing your cover letter, that's a plus. Um, another thing, so my advisor back in the day was Ray Carroll, and for all of his advisees, he bought a laser pointer. This is actually the next model of the same one, but it's not expensive and it makes life much easier. You can come prepared. There have been more than one time where like having a laser pointer has saved the day, at a talk and no one else has one, and you can be the one who comes in, and it makes giving talks much more comfortable if you're using the tools that you're already used to using. Business cards, that's another one. They're cheap. Uh, you don't have to splash out on, big fancy, the really thick business cards or anything like that, because, maybe it's just going to say, your name, graduate student, whatnot. But then you have something tangible to give to folks. I would say that's money well spent. And another one is internships. So most of y'all are eligible for summer internships. I know for international students, sometimes there's hoops to jump through for CPT issues, but most employers who are hiring for summer interns are happy to help you through the process if need be. And the department, at least back in the day, I imagine it still should have folks who can help out with the paperwork for that. And summer internships are a great opportunity. Even if you know you're going to end up in academia, then this is kind of your one chance to work in industry. So you might as well do that. You're going to get a lot of experience talking to non-statisticians, a lot of experience in a different model where, sort of the concept of deadlines and whatnot is very different. So I would highly recommend taking an internship if possible. Even if you don't take an internship, just the process of applying for it, you're sharpening your application skills so that by the time you're applying for a job because you're going to graduate soon, you've gone through this process, you've done it a few times, you know how to interview, you're comfortable with yourself, you're comfortable with your voice. Yeah, internships. So I actually interned with Stata the summer before I graduated, and it went really well, clearly. And I like them, they like me, and great. This makes life much easier. Now, I guess we go into applying for jobs. When I actually applied for jobs, though, even though I knew I really liked Stata, I didn't just apply to Stata. And that was another really good piece of advice that some folks a few years ahead of me gave me, which is apply to several jobs. Even if you have the one that you are absolutely, pie in the sky, you really want to work for UT Southwestern, or you really want to work for Amazon or something like that. Apply to a bunch of them. One, you might not get the one that you want. And two, even if you do, having multiple offers is great for negotiating. It gives you leverage that you absolutely do not have if you just have one offer. So if you really want to, teach at UT Southwestern, but you also get an offer from Rice, then you could say, hey, I would love to accept yours, but can you match their startup? Um, so uh, considering how much effort and how many years you've put into this process to get to where you are, the extra effort to apply to a few more jobs is a drop in the bucket, and it's really worth it. And that's true also if you're applying as a master's graduate. There's a lot of really good jobs you can get with a master's in statistics, and you can find through job portals online, through the ASA, and I would encourage you apply early if you can, and apply to multiple positions so that you have the pick. The applying early thing is also key. If you wait till the very end, sometimes folks wait until the deadline passes and then review all the resumes, but very often we're looking through the resumes as they come in, and if we find someone who's great a month before our deadline, we might have already found the person. So I would say get on that, get your resume out the door. And again, for industry, have a short and sweet to the point resume. 2 pages is fine as far as I'm concerned. Three, if you've done an awful lot of stuff. Beyond 3 pages, you're just wasting my time. So if you're, and then again, it's very different for academia than for industry. But in general, you really want to highlight your stuff and then put the links in to your GitHub, put the link into your website, put the link for your LinkedIn, so that if if what you put in your two-page resume is interesting enough for someone to want to learn more about you, they can just click through and find that instead of trying to put that all in one bloated PDF. All right, how to interview. So these days, a lot of interviews, at least first round interviews, are conducted by Zoom, which is both a blessing and a curse. Honestly, previously, a lot of first round interviews were conducted over the phone. And so I think that as sort of the folk on the other side doing the hiring, you get so much more information over Zoom than you would over just audio phone call. But it's a learned skill. So you can Zoom with your little sister and say like, "Hey, pretend you're the interviewer. Ask me some questions. Here's some ideas for questions, and then just go with that. Riff on it. You can ask your grandma. It's worth going through this several times. When I'm interviewing someone and they are clearly uncomfortable with the interview process, I'll try and cut them some slack because they're not, at least at Stata, they're not applying for the jobs that I'm hiring for a public speaking position. So we're not trying to be mean. And in general, unless you're applying for a job where you really are the face, folks will try and they'll try and really judge you on what your skill set is. But it doesn't hurt to look good, right? Like there's nothing wrong with being polished. And if you have to compare two people, one who has an awfully difficult time getting their concept across and one who's really smooth and polished, given the same publications, the same, degree, same level of research, the one who can convey the information is much more compelling. So yeah, ask your grandma, like, hey, ask me how to explain it. What's a p-value? I love that question because it's very simple to ask. And you can say like, hey, it's as if I were a high school senior, like tell me that sort of thing. So practice that. Another thing that I'm seeing more, it used to be that you'd sort of listen for if they're typing or see if they're actually if they're Googling the answers. Now you kind of wonder like, are they using AI tools to get the answer, especially for technical interviews? Are they trying to cheat the interview? That's I would say probably going to be a bigger issue going into the future. If you want to do an end run around that and make sure that there's no confusion, move yourself back from the camera so they can see your hands. No one's going to think that you're, being sneaky if you're a little farther away and they can see, you from the waist up because they know that you're not, looking stuff up. Or I've heard that there's even stuff that it'll put it sort of right there on your screen so that so your eyes aren't obviously moving around. And again, that's as a hiring manager, that's something that we're looking for. So if you don't want to be confused for that, then yeah, you can sort of make it obvious what tools you use and what tools you don't. I'm not saying not to use AI. I do as well. It's AI tools are very powerful. But when I'm interviewing someone and also everyone wants to talk about these days is AI. But when it comes up, the best answer that I can hear is, yes, I know how to use all those tools. No, I don't need them. I can get the same stuff done. It'll be a little slower, but I can get the same stuff done without those tools because I learned it the hard way. And now that I know it, I can leverage these. So I'm a decent Python coder, but I can punch above my weight with GitHub Copilot. Like my graphic skills are not that good, but if I use, Claude Design, then I can, turn out really polished stuff. If you're honest about that, then I think that goes a long way. And in general, honesty during interviews is really important. It's okay to say, I don't know. It's even better to say, I don't know, but here's what I would do to find that answer. So if I remember, I interviewed at a pharma company when I was looking for jobs, and they asked a question. They said, "Hey, if you run this, sort of pilot study, and you got this setup or this outcome, what would you do?" And I realized I had no idea. I just said, well, I really don't know. I'm sorry. And the guy said, "Okay, that's a fair answer. But if you had said this, it would have looked better." And I realized, okay, you know what? You can sort of give a little more. You can say, well, I don't know what I would do, but Here's how I would find out the answer. I know I have contacts who are experts in this. I would ask them, or you know what? I could simulate something, even though I don't know what's going on. I'll simulate a bunch of data. Simulation is a really powerful tool for a lot of things. I'll be talking about it a little bit in the power and sample size part, but having a backup answer beyond I don't know comes across really well. And then the last is how to negotiate. Again, having multiple job offers is really good, but in general, just knowing your value. So as a graduate student, you work long hours and you don't get paid a lot. And it's very easy to undervalue yourself and think like, oh my gosh, and it's a tough job market right now. I think like, please, like anything, like I will, scrape the sidewalk if you hire me. Um, on the flip side, there's some folks who come out and say like, "Oh my gosh, it's like the technology age. Like I should go in and demand like a senior vice president position and so you want to kind of play the middle road, but more often than not, what I see is folks who don't recognize their value coming out of a stats department with either a master's or a PhD. You are valuable. You have valuable skills and valuable tools, and you are not replaceable by AI. So, if you know that when you go into the negotiations, then you can sort of keep your head a little higher. Again, I wouldn't be overly aggressive or anything, but it is absolutely acceptable to negotiate salary. In fact, in a lot of fields, especially in industry, not trying to negotiate salary makes whoever hires you think, oh, I don't have to pay them that much. Like when it comes time to give them a raise, I can give them a little raise and they'll be really happy. If you negotiate salary from the get-go, your starting salary is higher and everything goes up from there. So I would definitely say negotiate. In academia, again, I don't work in academia, but there is a widely known, but I think unwritten rule is you need to get a competing offer to get a raise. Um, my sister is in academia and no one told her this. And she spent years sort of, struggling to get the recognition that she needed. And she finally realized, oh, even if my chair likes me, he can't go to the dean and say, I just want more money for her. He has to go to the dean and say, she's going to leave. She has an offer from Cornell, and she's going to take it unless we can match it or beat it. So in academia, you might not even want to leave, but you need to get those offers in order to make your case and for your superior to make the case to their superior that you deserve more money. All right, back to power. So let's see. So power and sample size. Again, I mentioned most of my work these days at Stata is statistical methods for medical studies. So a lot of that is power and sample size calculations. Folks, one of the things that I love about medical studies is they're one of the very few groups who tend to call the statisticians before they have data. Like usually, if you do you also have to take a consulting class? Okay. So usually folks come to you and say, "Hey, here's my awful messy data, like find me a small p-value." And I mean, and that's really good experience learning to talk to your clients like that and to collaborate and learning what terminology you use and how to be accessible, how to understand and be understood. But if you work with folks who come to you before they have data, it's a lot of fun. You can be like, oh, you're going to spend your money for something useful. So that's one of the nice things about medical studies. And so we're going to give a really, really simple example. We're going to imagine that we're testing a novel chemotherapy to see if it shrinks tumors. So our outcome is this continuous tumor shrinkage rate, or TSR. So it's just the change in diameters divided by the original diameter times the number of days as a percent. So again, in medical studies, the outcome I think it's just like lawyers have specialized terms to make you think that you need to hire a lawyer, and doctors have specialized terms in order to keep other people out. Well, in medical statistics, you don't call it the outcome, you call it the endpoint, even though it's not where the study ends. So this is an example of a continuous endpoint. Very often you'll have binary endpoints or time to event endpoints. There are others you can have multiple endpoints, so you can be looking at both efficacy and adverse events. That means like bad side effects. But again, in this very simple example, we have a continuous endpoint, so a continuous outcome. And we want to know, does our chemotherapy shrink the tumors? So, and again, this stuff's a little basic for y'all, but our null hypothesis is that it does not. Our one-sided alternative is that it does. And so we're going to conduct a z-test with a known standard deviation. So use a formula, a little blurry, for our z-statistic, where you're taking the average of all your participants minus the mean over sigma over square root of it. So we all know that. And I'll go through this stuff pretty quickly because you guys are fairly well versed in this, but this is your normal curve. Here's your alpha level. So if you say, all right, if my z-score after doing this test is above whatever your cutoff is, again, very commonly in medical stats, folks will use the classic p-values of two-sided 0.05. But that is changing slowly. But generally, it's null hypothesis significance testing, especially for late phase clinical trials, the really expensive ones, the ones that cost tens, hundreds of millions of dollars, because the FDA has a long track record of approving frequentist phase 3 clinical trials, and the Bayers and the Johnson and Johnsons and all the big companies, they are very reticent to try something new and novel. So even though they're really cool Bayesian designs, they are not used as often in the late phase, really expensive clinical trials as they are in the earlier phase ones that you don't have to submit to the FDA. And then here's our distribution under the alternative. Our effect size delta is, again, the average effect over several patients, what we expect the effect of our new drug to be. And you need to be able to calculate this in order to calculate how much power and what sample size you're going to need for your study. So again, in this case, we're doing a simple z-test, but you can do much more complicated tests as well. All right, so our critical value is, we're saying that is the value that's the cutoff, right? And we say, all right, if we set this cutoff such that if the null hypothesis is true, only 0.5, or usually when we do one-sided tests in the pharma world, they use 0.025 just to make it equivalent to one side of a two-sided 0.05 test. But that's where we set our line. And then let's look at that green curve and see, all right, what is the fraction of that curve to the right of that critical value? And that's our power. All right, so just to recap, the alpha level is the probability under the null of observing something beyond your critical value, and your power is the same, but if the alternative is true. So if you want to solve for power, the user's got to specify. Basically, it's sort of an equation or a system of equations with multiple unknowns. So if you know the alpha and the sample size and the effect size, then you can calculate the power. If you know the alpha and the power and the effect size, then you can calculate the sample size. If you know some of them, you can calculate the other ones. Usually, people don't try and solve for alpha, but you'll know that, and then the other three, you'll say, oh, I know 2 out of the 3. Let's solve for what I don't know. All right, so here's an example of how to do it in Stata. I appreciate that most of y'all don't use Stata. Honestly, before I started at Stata, I didn't either. Most grad students were using R, were using Python, or Julia. I don't know if folks still use Julia that much, but back before, I would say more folks use Python than Julia probably these days. But 10 years ago, there was a little wave on Julia. But Stata is the one who's paying for my kids' braces. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Stata and the pizza and whatnot. So it is a commercial software, which, again, as a grad student, I didn't have much money, but I had a lot of time. So I could spend hours and hours on Stack Overflow, but figuring out how to make my R code work because I didn't have a lot of money. Later on, if you say, hey, you know what, this time money curve makes it such that I'm willing to pay some money for commercial software that has a shallower learning curve or is more reproducible. That's another thing that would always frustrate me about R, is that you upgrade and then your package dependencies fall to pieces. And I know PackRat has made that a little bit better, but there still are some hoops to jump through. So again, that's where a commercial package fits in, where you say, oh, I want something that just works. I guess it's kind of the same reason people use like Apple. They want something that just works. So instead, also, but again, nowadays there are graphical interfaces for R as well. But for folks who don't like programming, it's really nice to be able to just do the drop-down menus and do a sort of a dialog box-based system. And so, is this big enough for y'all to see? So here is an example of how to do a power analysis for a test of one sample mean, which is our very simple example that we're testing. Whether this treatment effect is zero or not. All right. Now, what I'll be focusing on is power by simulation. And with the example of a one sample mean, the z-test, you don't need to use simulation to calculate the power. The formula is closed form. It's really easy. But it also makes the code much shorter if I'm trying to show you the code for how to do it. And the same concepts apply universally, no matter how complicated your test is. If you even want to figure out frequentist properties of Bayesian designs, you don't even have to use a frequentist design when you're doing simulation. You can simulate, do your Bayesian analysis, and somebody who's worried about the FDA says, "Oh, but what about the frequentist properties?" You say, "Oh, well, I'm going to simulate, and I'll let you know." So again, simple example here, but it can get as complicated as you want. And in this example, this is a StataCorp program that just draws from a normal distribution and then conducts a z-test and returns just a single binary outcome. Is the p-value from that statistical test less than whatever alpha you put in? And actually, I wrote all this code also. I didn't write the code. Claude wrote all this code in R also, because it's been a few years since I used R. So I said, you know what? I'm just going to pump this through Claude, and then I'll check it. So if you guys are at all interested, I do have R code up. We can sort of step through it. But this is what it looks like in Stata. And then you can try it out. So you say, all right, I'm going to set my random seed. Whenever you're doing simulations, you really want to be careful about setting your random seed for reproducibility. And you need to know when to set it. Because again, if you want to show someone exactly what you did, you're going to need to be able to use the same random seed as your examples, and when not to set it. So if you're in the middle of doing multiple simulations, you're not going to want to reset your seed during simulations. Then you're going to have the same RNG state each round, and you're going to do the same simulation 1,000 times as opposed to 1,000 different simulations. So you do want to be careful. That is something that bites people frequently. All right, so in Stata, you can do what's called a power user method command, which is we have our official power suite, which has all the built-in commands for simple stuff like this. And in Stata, you don't even need to write your own analytical function, much less a simulation-based one. You can just say power one mean, here's my null, here's my alternative, boom, I'm done. But if you want to create a power command for a new method, then this is sort of the scaffolding that allows users to do that. And so you basically write this command that takes as an input what your sample size is, and then everything within these square braces here are optional arguments with the default afterwards. So what your alpha is, what your mean under the null, mean under the alternative, how many replications, and what seed you want. And so that it'll run that, it'll simulate it however many times you tell it to, and then it'll give you a summary of, hey, how many times did I reject that null hypothesis? And that is your simulated power. And again, the R code is very, very similar for the same thing. So we can look at that in a minute. But if we run it, then this is a more Stata specific slide with the custom command. It doesn't know that we're back here. So if you see, we are doing our test. Go. We are looking at. There we go. Oh, I think it doesn't show on the screen. I'll use this. All right, we are doing a one-sided test, upper one, because that was our hypothesis of interest, right? Our alternative hypothesis is our new test, new treatment better? Does it shrink the tumors better than before? So once we do this in Stata, since we didn't tell Stata that we were running a one-sided test, then it thinks we're doing a two-sided test. So in Stata, one of the tricks you can do is, we'll get back to that, you can write what's called an initializer, which tells Stata all the important things like, hey, when you graph it, these are the symbols that you should use for the various things. Hey, this is actually a one-sided test. Here's the title that you should use. Uh, and you can do similar stuff in R, although I haven't played around with R graphics nearly as much in quite a long time. But when you're doing this, you're going to get one number, and it's useful to know, all right, what is the estimation error in this, right? Because it is a Monte Carlo procedure, so you want to know what is the Monte Carlo error. The formula is very simple. It's just your standard error of power is the square root of power times 1 minus power over the number of replications. So we could say, all right, in the example that we just gave, our standard error of the power estimate is 0.007. If that's too high, bump up the number of replications. So you can replicate. It's cheap. Computing power is ubiquitous. So you can increase the number of replications. Now, if each round is a really complicated Bayesian model that takes a long time to converge, then things get more complicated. But the nice thing about simulation is it is embarrassingly parallel. Again, I haven't used the high performance clusters here in almost a decade, but when I did, it was great. You'd go into the Slurm server and you say like, spin up a no, well, I think you try to do 1,000 cores, you'd run out of your quota really quick. But like spin up 500 cores, spin up or 200 cores, and each one do a different simulation. And as long as you're making sure that you don't use the same random seed for each, that's the gotcha. But you can do all this stuff completely parallel and then collect the information at the end. Not everything is as easy to parallelize as simulations like this, but these simulations, what happens in one doesn't affect the other. So that's a really simple way of increasing your computing power with a multi-core processor or access to the big systems. So I know since I left, Hendrix retired, so I don't know who is in charge of making all the computers work, but find them, be friends with them. That's a really good person to be friends with. The custodians and the IT folks are your best friends, and you will go far by treating them well and getting in with them. They can help you out a lot. So, all right. So in this example, we did this power by simulation, but what if I know what power I want? I'm trying to figure out what sample size, right? So most folks who come to you, if you're a biostatistician and they're designing a clinical trial, they're going to say, all right, I want 80% power. I want 90% power, and I want an alpha of 0.025. All right, what sample size do I need? They don't. Sometimes they say, hey, my funding is such that I can afford 300 people. What's the power? But usually they'll say, I'm not going to get published if I don't have, or I'm not going to get funding for this grant if I don't demonstrate that I have 90% power. So how many subjects do I need? And so one way is sort of just a guess and check, right? So in this example, in Stata, you can just sort of throw in this, oh, where we go here, this part here of 40, then parentheses 2, then 50 means step from 40 to 50 by increments of 2. So 40, 42, 44, 46, 48, 50. We're going to step through those. And for each of those, run the whole process where you do the whole simulation with 5,000 reps each. And then show me what is the power at that. And then you say, okay, well, I'm going to look through here and I'm going to say, if I want 90, then about 42. So that is totally valid and it is an effective way to do it, but we can automate that instead of having to do this sort of guess and check. But the ability to do this and to graph it is really nice, especially for sensitivity analysis where you say, I don't really know what my effect size is going to be. So I'm going to try a whole range of values and see what would the power be or what would the sample size be under the whole range of values. So this is the initializer I mentioned. And then after the initializer, you can see it's displaying as a one sample z-test, and it's telling you it's powered by simulation, and it's putting the parameters with the symbols that we want, the alpha, the mu naught, the mu a. So again, haven't done that part particularly in R, but as far as like the actual number crunching part, you get the random seed is different, but you get the exact same math in R. And same if you did in Python or any other package, you can do MATLAB, whatever you want. Okay, so what about, I wish I could get this thing off my screen. So at any rate, this is how we use the power command in Stata to calculate sample size by simulation. This is a pretty simple first pass at it, but it's using what's called a bisection algorithm, which is if you're doing a search and each time and especially if it's a one-dimensional search, right? You're just trying to optimize one thing. So we're just trying to find just the right sample size. How many subjects do we need? And each time you do it, you're going to know, am I too high or too low? So if you're too high, then you say, all right, then I'm not going to go any higher than this. I'm going to shrink the search space by half. So each time you do it, you shrink the search space by half. It is not the world's most efficient because it's stepping through by half, but it always gets smaller every single time you do it. So it's even though it seems conceptually like, gosh, there should be a faster way if I do, if I knew the gradient or if I could, get a Hessian or something like that, I could do a more sophisticated method. Bisection search is simple and effective and generally works pretty well. So this is an example using that. I'm going to step through this fairly quickly because it's Stata code that I don't think is as germane to y'all. But again, we have the same thing in our code if anyone's interested. So basically, we just take a whole bunch of inputs, including the stuff that we saw before, the alpha, the mean under the null, mean under the alternative. And then we have some here. We also have what do we start with for sample size? What's the maximum and minimum value for sample size? The tolerance for the power search, how many iterations you're willing to do in the bisection algorithm. And then these other are for integration with a different Stata command that we'll talk about in a bit. So we step through this program. So first thing that you do, and this is sort of good programming practices in general, is check your inputs. So if the user enters this, if they say, oh, I want a sample size of -8, you need to issue a nice error message. Don't core dump on that. So check all your inputs, make sure that your maximum value is not too low, that your minimum value is not too high, and then run your first iteration. We're going to run this same Power CMD1 mean sim. That's that simulation program that we wrote before. We're going to run that once and see what we get. And we're going to see, all right, what's the difference between the power that this simulation runs and the power that we want? And then instead of doing that sort of guess and check over the 42, 44, 46, 48, we're going to automate that with a bisection algorithm. So we're going to step through this starting at 1, and this while loop contains, so I mean, one of the nice things about a bisection algorithm is you can write the entire thing on one slide. So starting at 1, you're just going to loop through, and if the difference is greater than 0, then you're overpowered. If the difference is less than 0, then you're underpowered. And so you're going to shrink by half every single iteration. And if you've reached the last iteration, then end. And otherwise keep shrinking. Basically, as long as your difference is bigger than whatever your tolerance is, you're going to keep iterating. Once you've shrunk that search space small enough to whatever your preset tolerance was, you say, okay, that's good enough. I'm stopping there. And then at the end, I'm going to return all this information. And again, in R, you would store this all in a single object. In Stata, you use the return command to get it back to the user, but it's basically the same thing. You can say, okay, I'm going to say, what is the sample size that met those criterion? What's the alpha and null and alternative hypotheses? These are the same things that the user entered in. But again, good practice for programming is if the user enters a bunch of stuff in, when you're giving them output, tell them back what they entered in. So that way, if they copy paste their results, they have the whole story, not just sort of an orphan number floating around. All right. And then again, with this initializer, this is another way of adding sort of the fancy stuff to the graphs and to the tables in Stata. And then we use it. So we're trying this as a power command. So we're saying, let's do our power command of one mean sample size with 90% power, an alpha of 0.025. We're saying under the null, the mean is 0. Under the alternative, the mean is 0.5. I'm going to guess 100 subjects to start with. We're going to use 500 reps per simulation, and we're setting our random seed. So when we do that, the program will basically just sort of walk through and calculate the sample size for you using that method. So at this point, I'm actually going to pause from that and step over to R Studio and walk through it in R. So this is again the very, very simplest function, one mean sim, that's just running a single simulation. So your output from this is, did I reject that p-value? So it's a binary output from one simulation. So let's run this. It's always dangerous running live code in a talk, but there we go. Okay, so I can't see. There we go. One. Can you see that? No, can't see that either. But one. So with my seed of 9, yes, I do reject that, which is unsurprising because we had an N of 50, which given the background that we've seen, we knew that 42 was giving us, 42, 43 was giving us about 90%. So we're probably going to do that a lot. So if we just run that same one mean sim a bunch of times, it's 1 most of the time. We get a few zeros in there, but right now, each time I'm hitting enter, I'm running one simulation of this. And again, you automate this and it does it 5,000 times in a blink of an eye because this is a really fast program to evaluate. But we can automate it with this function that basically does the same thing. It's just a wrapper that runs our original function, one mean sim, and then uses lapply to vectorize it. Do you guys have a programming class in R because R is notoriously slow in loops, and lapply, sapply are lifesavers to make R code run faster. So if you don't have a class that does that, it doesn't take long to learn that stuff on your own. If you do, I know Henrik used to teach one. I don't know if there is, but that's really useful. Sometimes you can't, just lapply or sapply and vectorize things and make things go faster. You have to go through a loop. When you do that, there is something called RCPP, so you can write C++ code, and which may seem daunting for someone who doesn't have a computer science background. But again, with AI tools, that's actually much easier. But even without AI tools, there are some libraries. I used to really like RCPP Armadillo, which gives syntax very similar to MATLAB. If you ever use MATLAB, it's very similar to R syntax. And so it doesn't, the learning curve is not awful, and the speed improvement is huge. So if you're, trying to publish a paper and you're trying to do, I don't know, a few 100,000 simulations for your paper, you're going to have to try that a bunch of times before you figure out the right settings. So in total, you're probably doing millions of simulations. So any improvement in speed is really valuable. So the first time you write code, you don't want to worry about optimization. That's a classic programmer's boondoggle, is worrying about optimization when you're first writing the code. No, the first thing is get it working. Then once you've gotten it working, the best practice is to profile your code and see, where is it slow? If I'm going to spend 3 days optimizing this part that takes 2% of the time, then I'm not investing my energy well. R has a profiler that I don't remember what it's called, but actually really, really powerful. And you can say, all right, where is it spending a lot of time? And that's where you want to invest your energy and benchmark your code. Like say, all right, I'm going to run just this little bit and I'm going to run it 1,000 times and see how long it takes. Now I'm going to change. Instead of doing this as matrix multiplication, I'm going to do it as an sapply or something like that. And see how does that affect the speed, or gosh, none of this works. All right, I've got to drop down to RCPP. So you do that. There's a book by Dirk Edelbutel on how to use RCPP. with R, and it's a skinny little book, 100 pages or so, and very, very informative. I would say worth the money. I definitely got more than my money's worth on that book. And it makes a lot of the slow R stuff much faster so that you can get your research done without having to become a full computer scientist. So that's, I would say, a really useful tool when lapply or sapply is not enough for vectorization. All right, so here's our function. Let's just run the whole thing. Okay, sounds good. So, and then let's run it. So we're saving our result as res, and we're going to print it here. So our alpha is 0.025. Our sample size is 50. The power is 93%, which again, when we hit enter a bunch of times and saw it, unsurprisingly, we saw a lot of ones and not too many zeros. Now, what if all right, we can calculate our Monte Carlo standard, but since we're running short on time, another thing in this case, because we're doing a really simple example, it's always nice to do a sanity check and say, all right, here's my analytic version. Do I get something that makes sense? So you do that and you say, all right, the analytic power is 94%. So if I'm doing a simulation with only, what was it, about 5,000, 1,000 replications, then yeah, 93.5% is totally reasonable. So let's try doing the same thing with a whole vector of sample sizes. And we get kind of the same style curve that we saw before in Stata. Again, I think if I bumped up the number of replications, it'd be a little smoother. But again, as the sample size goes up, power goes up. And then here is that bisection algorithm in R. So let's just go through and try this. So again, it did the whole thing in basically the time it takes to hit enter, and we will see, all right, we get a power of 90.4% with a sample size of 43. So using the bisection algorithm, it says, all right, you should have 43 subjects if you want 90% power, but the achieved power, the attained power is going to be 90.4% on average. Again, with these simulation settings. Now, if you're going to go give this to a client or something like that, I would suggest bump up your replications. It doesn't take a lot of time or energy to do that, and you can get more confidence. Again, your Monte Carlo standard error will decrease. But for just such a quick example, it actually worked really well. All right, now let's go back to, where are we? This is all for fixed sample designs, but when you're dealing with human subjects, very often you collect data sort of in dribs and drabs. You recruit subjects over time, and you get their endpoints, their outcomes over time. So in a traditional fixed design, you plan your study, you recruit, you do your final analysis, and then you make your decision. Do you reject your null or do you not? That's not what I want to do. Okay, so let's do slideshow. There. In a group sequential design, the idea is I'm going to do sequential testing, but not after every single person's data is collected. I'm going to wait for a group. And I'm going to do the same planning and recruit subjects, but then after I hit a preset point, I'm going to do an interim analysis. And if the interim analysis is convincing enough, if the data speaks so strongly that I say, you know what, I can already reject my null, then you stop, you save a lot of money, you save exposing the subjects to an inferior treatment, which again, you've got these ethical concerns in a human study. Everyone's really happy when that happens. Alternatively, you can set up what's called futility balance to stop for futility. You start your study, you run through the first maybe third of what you expect for your sample size, you do an interim analysis, and it turns out you're not only got enough, your effect is negative, like your treatment is awful. Well, stop your treatment right now because there's very little chance you're going to reject that null hypothesis. And if you stop it now, you're going to avoid giving people this useless treatment. So again, from an ethical standpoint, it's a big win. And then once you reach your final maximum sample size, then you've only got two options. So again, these interim analyses, you could stop for efficacy, stop for futility, or continue. The final one, it's either go or no go.
Group sequential designs allow researchers to analyze data from an ongoing clinical trial and to stop the trial early if they find compelling evidence that a treatment is effective or ineffective.
All right, so this is narrated by my lovely coworker Megan, who's much better at graphics and presentations than I am. But it shows a graphical view where on this vertical axis, this is your Z value, so your Z score, and on your x-axis is sample size. So after we collected 6 people, so that was the first 3 on the control and 3 on the alternative treatment, we ran analysis and it landed in that green continuation region. So we kept going, ran another one. By the 4th out of 6 planned analyses, we had landed in that rejection region. So we reject the null and we stop early. We stop with only about 25 or so patients instead of the maximum of 35. So this is one of several what are called adaptive designs for clinical trials. But anyone who is interested in pharma, adaptive designs are a big field within clinical trials. And there are adaptive designs for early phase clinical trials where you're still trying to figure out the dose. And there are adaptive designs for late phase clinical trials where you're trying to determine efficacy. Group sequential designs are usually used later phase where you're trying to develop basically evidence for efficacy. All right. We're doing time. We stop at 12:50, is that right?
Around there, yeah. Take us some time for questions as well.
Okay.
Or end time as well.
Okay, sounds good. So here is the syntax for the group sequential design. So this is one of my previous projects in Stata. So I'm not going to go in great detail about this, but in Stata, basically, you can do something like you say, all right, GS design one mean sample size. So this is the simulation command that we wrote earlier, and it will run that command and say, all right, if I were to use these stopping boundaries that you gave me, and again, I'm not going to go into detail, but there are different shapes basically for those stopping boundaries curves. If I'm going to use those with the interim looks or interim analyses spaced in a certain order, here's what I would expect for the sample size. So your maximum number of samples in this case would be 42, but your expectation, if the null is true, then on average, and I were to run this many times, on average, I would use a few less than 42. But if the alternative is true, on average, I'm going to stop well before I reach that last analysis and save some significant time and money, and also not expose people to an inferior treatment. So this is the graph of that example. And again, in this one, we just had an efficacy stopping. So in this example, the planners of the trial said, I don't want to stop for futility. Even if it's doing poorly, I don't want to know. I'm just going to bury my head in the sand. But if it's doing great, I want to stop early. That's actually surprisingly common. Folks will invest a lot of time and energy in this, and they really want it to succeed. So they don't want to stop, even if the initial signs that they say, oh no, it's just a fluke. So that's why when you have futility balance, like in this other example, the most common type of futility balance are called non-binding futility balance, which means that even if your first analysis is within this futility region, you can continue the study and you will not overrun your type 1 error. Because we know that somebody, some senior vice president somewhere really likes this molecule and they really want it to win. So they're going to keep going. And in case your first analysis, it's way down here, but somehow by the time it gets to the end, it is in the rejection zone, you will have not overspent your type 1 error. So there's a sort of minor nuance between binding and non-binding futility balance. And that's about it for group sequential designs. So any questions on any of the power sample size stuff or the sort of general grad student job application material?
First, let's thank our speaker.
Yeah.
Yeah, any questions for Dr. Ash?
Yes, I have a simple question here. First, thank you for this nice presentation. And imagine that a situation where you have like group of physicians who are going to apply for grants, and they come to you to consultation to ask you, I need to do this and this, and you said that it would be better to start before collecting the data. And we need you to help us with the sample size determination. And we know that in clinical trials, sometimes you start with 100 and you ended up with like 60 or 40. The question here, what will be the optimal minimum sample size and maximum sample size for this situation? It's just in a simple way.
With basically taking into account withdrawal or loss to follow up, basically people who enter the study and don't continue. That's a really good question. And the best answer is to do a small pilot study, or if you have other studies that are of a similar population, you can do a better job modeling what the dropout rate is going to be. So if you say, all right, I have basically a good reason to believe that 90% of the people who start are going to finish it, then all you do is you say, all right, well, I'm going to divide whatever sample size I get by 0.9, and that's how many people I need to actually recruit. Now, if you don't know, then you'll either do a sensitivity analysis, say, okay, I'm going to do my power calculation or my sample size calculation, but I'm going to try a range of dropout rates. So what if the withdrawal rate is 10%? What if it's 20%? What if it's 30%? And say, all right, how much can I afford? Or run a small, much cheaper pilot study, and that will give you a much better starting estimate of your effect size, and it'll let you know information about stuff like the dropout rate and also adverse events. So like the negative side effects, you can get information about that from a pilot study. So I said those are two good sort of ways to address this, but it is a thorny question because you're right, with clinical trials, not everyone who starts the trial is going to give you data at the end.
Okay, the follow-up question, what is like the accepted or the most common power of test required by clinical trial, let's say by FDA? So to be able to do that, you must show up like 90% or whatever.
That's a good question. I don't want to go beyond my knowledge and then sort of speak for the FDA. It is very common for people to shoot for 90% power, but I've never submitted a new drug application to the FDA. So when you do that, you don't sort of come in cold. You coordinate with the FDA beforehand. You'll have meetings with the FDA statistician. The FDA hires good statisticians. For folks who are looking for jobs, they hire really competent folks. And they've also been hiring more Bayesian folks, more folks who use R. So it's not all SAS, it's not all frequentists these days. And you meet with them and have that discussion beforehand to say like, hey, what power do I need in order for you to take my study seriously? So I'd say 90% is commonly used, but I wouldn't just go ahead and do that. I would meet with the regulators first, or if it's outside the US, the European Medicines Agency or the Japanese I don't remember the acronym, but yeah, wherever the regulatory environment is, you would want to meet with them early on in the process so as not to spend a lot of time and money doing something that they don't even like.
Thank you so much.
Oh, wow.
Any other questions? Now let's thank our speaker once last time.
Thank you guys very much.
Thank you for coming to speak with us.